There is a stretch of water 21 miles wide at its narrowest point that controls 20% of the world's entire oil supply. Every tanker leaving the Persian Gulf passes through it. Every barrel of crude heading to Japan, China, India, and Europe moves through this corridor. Shut it down, and energy markets on 3 continents collapse within days. For decades, Iran understood this, and for decades, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps built an entire military doctrine around one central idea, that the Strait of Hormuz was untouchable. Theirs, a loaded gun they could press against the throat of the global economy whenever they needed leverage. On May 7, 2025, the IRGC decided to use that gun. By the following morning, the doctrine they had spent 30 years building was burning on the coastline. The command centers, the radar networks, the missile silos, the drone launch ramps, the fast attack boat fleets, all of it reduced to debris by a U.S. air operation that lasted a matter of hours. Iran had made the calculation that America would not strike back. That calculation was the most expensive mistake the Revolutionary Guard has ever made. This is what happened, and this is what it means for everything that comes next. Part 1, 3 destroyers and a trap. The events of May 7th did not begin with a missile. They began with a decision made in Washington weeks earlier. The U.S. Navy had identified that Iran's naval posture in the Strait of Hormuz had shifted from defensive to actively hostile. IRGC fast attack vessels were conducting what military analysts describe as swarming harassment operations, surrounding commercial ships, forcing course changes, and using drone overflights to gather targeting data on vessels transiting the corridor. The strait had effectively become a gauntlet. Washington's response was to send a signal. 3 guided missile destroyers were ordered to transit the strait in formation, not as a show of aggression, but as a direct assertion that these are international waters and the United States Navy will sail them. The USS Truxtun led the formation, a Burke-class destroyer out of Norfolk, fully combat-armed with an air defense capability capable of tracking and engaging dozens of simultaneous threats. Behind it came the USS Rafael Peralta. Behind that, the USS Mason, both homeported out of Mayport, Florida, both equipped with the same layered defense architecture. 3 steel ships, a combined firepower package that represents decades of naval warfare development. The IRGC watched them enter the strait and made their decision. What followed was not a warning shot or a probing gesture. It was a coordinated multi-vector assault. Anti-ship missiles launched from concealed coastal ramps, swarms of Shahed series kamikaze drones angled down from altitude toward the ship's decks, and from the surface, dozens of small fast attack boats racing in from multiple directions simultaneously, attempting to create confusion faster than the destroyer's defensive systems could process it. Iran's asymmetric warfare doctrine, refined over 3 decades and tested in countless smaller engagements, was being executed in full. It was over in minutes. The destroyer's close-in weapon systems shredded the incoming drones before they reached effective range. Standard missiles locked onto the anti-ship threats and eliminated them in the air. The fast attack boats were engaged by the ship's deck guns and by MH-60 Seahawk helicopters that launched from the flight decks and pursued the surviving vessels across the surface. Every threat was neutralized. Not one of the 3 destroyers took a single hit. President Trump later described watching footage of the Iranian drones falling into the sea. He said it looked at butterflies dying. The language was deliberate, a psychological signal dressed as poetry. What he was communicating was this: your weapons are not weapons to us. They are theater. The IRGC had fired everything it had at 3 American warships in broad daylight and achieved nothing.
Part 2, the retaliation that followed that same night. Within hours of the failed attack, U.S. Central Command had already completed its target list. This was not improvised. The strike package that executed that evening had been in planning for weeks, a pre-built operation waiting for exactly this kind of trigger. The IRGC had just provided it. As darkness settled over the Gulf, the sky above Al Dhafra Air Base in the United Arab Emirates became a controlled storm of activity. More than 5 aerial refueling tankers, massive KC-135 and KC-46 aircraft lifted off in succession and took up loitering patterns over the Gulf waters, establishing what effectively became a fuel bridge in the sky. This infrastructure is what allows fighter jets to operate far from their bases at extended range for hours at a time without returning to refuel. The USS George H.W. Bush, operating in the Gulf, launched its strike aircraft. The USS Abraham Lincoln added its own complement. Growler electronic warfare jets moved ahead of the strike packages, flooding Iranian radar frequencies with interference. Iranian air defense operators stared at screens showing nothing but static. The threats were already inbound before anyone on the ground understood what was happening. FA-18 Super Hornets carried the strike loads. F-35C jets penetrated deeper, targeting the most hardened positions. Precision-guided munitions, JDAMs, and Paveway series bombs were used throughout. The United States committed no ground forces. Every target was engaged from the air, at range, with weapons that arrived without warning. The strikes hit 5 separate areas along Iran's Hormuz coastline in a single coordinated sequence: Bandar Abbas, Qeshm Island, the Sur coastal zone, Bandar-e-Kamir, the Minop coastal region. 5 targets, 1 night. The operation was described by CENTCOM as a precision defensive response targeting only military infrastructure. That framing was accurate, but the scope of what constituted military infrastructure in these locations was staggering.
Part 3. What was destroyed and why it mattered. To understand the magnitude of what the U.S. military erased that night, you have to understand what these locations actually were. Bandar Abbas was not simply a port city. It was the operational headquarters of the IRGC Navy, the nerve center from which the entirety of Iran's Hormuz strategy was commanded and coordinated. The frigates Jamaran and Sahand were directed from here. The logistical infrastructure for Iran's fast attack boat fleet was housed here. Coastal anti-ship missile launch ramps lined the shoreline. Underground silos held Silkworm and Sunburn anti-ship missiles. The guidance and targeting centers for C-801 series missiles, Chinese-supplied weapons capable of striking capital ships, operated from this location. The SSN-22 Sunburn radar network, which had been scanning the strait for years, was anchored here. U.S. missiles turned the command centers and launch infrastructure up Bandar Abbas to ash within the opening minutes of the strike. Qeshm Island was a different kind of target, and in some ways a more significant one. The largest island in the Persian Gulf, covering nearly 1,500 square kilometers, Qeshm had been systematically militarized over the past decade. Beneath its surface, Iranian engineers had constructed an extensive network of underground tunnels, described by regional defense analysts as a missile city hidden under the earth. Kilometers of reinforced concrete passages held stockpiles of Shahed 136 kamikaze drones waiting to be launched. Qadir and Nasser anti-ship missile systems were stored in these underground silos. Khaibar ballistic missiles occupied separate passages. The tunnel entrances were sealed by precision-guided bombs dropped with enough accuracy to collapse the openings without requiring penetration of the full depth. Radar installations on the island's surface, which had provided Iran with continuous surveillance of Gulf shipping traffic, were eliminated by JDAM strikes. The Siri coastal zone held Iran's newest asset, the Shahid Rajaei naval base, opened in 2020 and positioned to control the eastern approach to the strait. Every ship entering Hormuz from the Gulf of Oman direction was first detected by this base's early warning systems. It was the front door of Iran's surveillance architecture in the region, and its targeting intelligence fed directly into the missile systems at Qeshm and Bandar Abbas. By the time the strikes were complete, that intelligence pipeline was severed. The radars were gone, the command notes were gone, the launch infrastructure was gone. Iran had spent 3 decades and an enormous share of its defense budget building a system designed to hold the Strait of Hormuz as a hostage. In one night, the United States systematically removed every component of that system.
Part 4. The confusion in Tehran. In the hours immediately after the strikes, the Iranian government did not know who had hit them. This is not speculation. It is reflected in the initial statements that emerged from Tehran and in the behavior of Iranian state media in the hours that followed. 2 days before the Hormuz attack, on May 4th and 5th, Iran had launched a separate salvo against the United Arab Emirates: 12 ballistic missiles, 3 cruise missiles, and an undisclosed number of drones targeting the Fujairah industrial zone. Major fires had broken out in the Emirates' petroleum infrastructure. There had been casualties. Iran publicly denied involvement. When the massive explosions began along the Hormuz coastline on the night of May 7th, Iran's initial assumption was that the UAE was retaliating. The scale of the destruction, the precision of the strikes, the speed with which the operation moved, all of it temporarily convinced Iranian commanders that this was an Emirati counterstrike. The UAE Defense Ministry said nothing. It watched. When the truth became clear that the strikes had been American, Iranian state media moved immediately into damage control. The Fars and Tasnim news agencies, both close to IRGC leadership, began reporting that the explosions were the result of routine air defense exercises. Then the narrative shifted to claims that civilian areas had been hit. No evidence accompanied either claim. The Iranian government was doing what governments do, and they have absorbed a blow they cannot publicly acknowledge: manufacturing an alternative reality for domestic consumption. The military knew what had been destroyed. The question was whether the political leadership would accept what that destruction meant for the negotiations underway.
Part 5. The Diplomatic Knife Edge. Behind the missiles and the burning coastline, a parallel war had been unfolding on paper, and the military events of May 7th were directly connected to it. Before the attack on the U.S. destroyers, a fragile ceasefire had been holding since April. The agreement was barely functional, described accurately by analysts as a pause, not a peace. Both sides were negotiating the terms of a more permanent arrangement, and the gap between their positions was enormous. Iran had arrived at the table with a 14-point list of demands: complete withdrawal of all American military forces from the region, war reparations, return of frozen Iranian financial assets, billions in additional compensation payments, and, most provocatively, an entirely new international governance mechanism for the Strait of Hormuz, structured under Iranian control. Washington's response was to place those demands in a drawer and close it. Instead, the United States sent a one-page memorandum of understanding to Tehran through Pakistani diplomatic intermediaries. The document was deliberately concise. It proposed a 30-day structured negotiation process with specific conditions that had to be met before talks could begin: the immediate opening of the strait to all commercial traffic, the complete cessation of IRGC proxy operations across the region, a halt to all funding for militant networks including Hezbollah, and the full suspension of nuclear enrichment activity. This document was described by one senior administration official as Iran's last honorable exit. Tehran was considering it. A formal response was expected within 24 hours. Then, the IRGC attacked the destroyers. The U.S. military response that followed was not purely retaliatory in military terms. It was also a negotiating message, delivered in the language of precision munitions. The implicit communication was direct: if you attack us while we are offering you a way out, we will demonstrate exactly what total military escalation looks like, and we will do it without deploying a single ground soldier. White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt made the position explicit in the briefing that followed. She stated that if Iran had not yet understood that it had been militarily defeated, it would be struck harder than it had ever been struck in its history. These were not empty words. They were the public face of a strategy that had just proven itself capable of executing exactly what it was threatening.
The Strait of Hormuz carries 20% of the world's oil. Through that corridor moves the energy that keeps Japan's factories running, China's cities lit, India's economy turning, and Europe's heating on through winter. It is one of the most consequential 21 miles of water on the planet. Iran built a military architecture specifically designed to hold that corridor as leverage. Fast attack boats, drone swarms, underground missile cities on fortified islands, a radar network that could track every vessel from the moment it entered the Gulf. 3 decades of investment in a strategy built on the premise that no adversary would risk the economic consequences of a full military response. That premise was tested on May 7th and found to be wrong. The 3 destroyers passed through the strait undamaged. The systems that attacked them were destroyed the same night. The command networks that directed the attack no longer exist. The radar installations that fed targeting data are gone. The launch infrastructure, the ramps, the silos, the tunnels, has been sealed and burned. Tanker insurance premiums have spiked sharply. Global shipping routes are being recalculated. At the United Nations, American and Bahraini delegations are circulating new sanctions language. China's bypass shipping networks have absorbed significant disruption. Japan's energy supply chain is operating under elevated risk assessments. The world's most important maritime choke point is now the center of the most consequential power struggle in the global energy order. Iran now faces a choice with a very short deadline. It can accept the terms on that one-page document, open the strait, rein in its proxies, halt the nuclear program, and enter 30 days of structured negotiation with the outcome far from guaranteed, but the country still intact. Or it can allow the IRGC to continue making the decisions, in which case American officials have now demonstrated, rather than merely stated, what the military consequence of that choice looks like. Trump's final message was precise: sign the agreement or watch what remains of your military capability disappear from the map. The Strait of Hormuz has seen empires rise and fall along its banks. What is being decided in these days at negotiating tables in Islamabad and on radar screens above the Gulf will determine who controls it for the next generation. Will Tehran's political leadership take the exit that is still on the table? Or will the Revolutionary Guard make the decision for them and force a confrontation that ends with Iran losing the strait entirely? Tell us what you think is coming next in the comments below.
and you want to follow these developments as they unfold, subscribe. This story is far from over.